So when it comes to using stories for advertising, I'm going to give you my favorite. I believe there's 5 types of stories that I typically go to whenever I'm creating an ad, especially if I'm using an ad up front where I want to generate leads or I want to generate interest for my business. The underdog story is one of my favorites. Everybody, how many of you have seen the movie Rudy? Rudy? Yeah? Great movie. Everybody loves an underdog story. We love to root for the underdog. Everything was going, they succeeded despite all odds being against them and everyone doubting them. And I've got an example of that. In fact, one of the ads you're going to download is an example of that. But here's a classic example of an underdog ad that ran forever, incredibly successful ad. The title was, "When They Laughed When I Sat Down at the Piano, but when I started to play, ... And it's this story of, everybody doubted me. I never really felt like anybody felt like I was worth anything. I didn't have any prestige. And everybody wants to feel important, right? So this ad was not tapping into why you should buy music lessons. It was tapping into a deeper desire of, I want to be important. I want people to respect me. I want people to feel like I'm worth something in this world, right? That's really what sold so many of these music lessons at this academy back in New York in, the 1940s or whenever this ad ran in the newspaper. Incredibly successful ad, told an underdog story, right? And you can tell an underdog story as well. Here's one of my own ads. This is one you're going to get to download. I don't have time to read the whole thing to you, but you can read it on your own. And it basically tells a story about how whenever I was in network marketing and I turned to the internet, I was scolded by my upline trainer. And I was like, why would you scold me? I'm trying to build a business that benefits you. And when I told this story in the ad, I had people rooting for me as the underdog because I wasn't successful. Well, and of course I stole the headline. Look at the headline of this ad. My upline scolded me for using the internet, and then this happened, ... So that grabs their attention. They read the story. I build their desire. They go, wow, this guy understands me. And then they take the next step to go further with me in my business. My second favorite type of story is the horrible thing that happened, or the embarrassing story, the embarrassing thing that happened. And what this is it's a horror story of something that went horribly wrong, and it could have been avoided if they had only known blank, or if they had only done this differently. Or maybe it was avoided, right? Maybe you were on the path. Misha told you yesterday he was on the path to, drugs, prescription drugs, right? He told you this horror story. That built a lot of desire in a lot of people who might feel depressed, right? That was a smart story for him to tell, for you to kind of feel like, yeah, this is something I can do. And so whenever I tell a horror story in my business, this is a great example. I've been running this exact same ad copy for a couple of years, still performs great. This tells a story of I bought a bunch of leads from a lead generation company. This is when I didn't know how to generate my own leads, and I got on the phone, called them up, everybody was rejecting me, and basically got on the phone with this one lady, and she rejected me, and I said, well, why would this lead generation company have given me your name and said you were interested if you're not? And she said, oh, well, they said I'd be entered for a contest to win a trip to Hawaii if I put in my name and email on their web form. And her mouth just went, well, guess what? That same kind of anger in my prospects when they're reading it builds their desire to go, I don't want to be duped like that. I don't want to be taken advantage of. And so the whole moral of that story is, and I came to a very powerful conclusion that day. The most powerful conclusion I came to was the only qualified lead I'm ever going to generate is a lead I generate myself. If I rely on somebody else, it ain't going to be valuable. It ain't going to be good. And so they now formed their own conclusion. He's right. I have to stop relying on other people for my leads. I need to learn how to generate leads. They formed their own conclusion. They had the desire. They went over, they took the next step. They attended my webinar, and they buy all my products, and now I make money, right? Okay. Whew, that was a lot to say. Number 3 favorite story to tell is the winners versus losers story. This is, I call it the tale of two blanks. So you tell a story of one person who made one decision, another person who made another decision, and oh man, they ended up on totally different paths. There's a classic example of this. Again, you're going to get this so you can read through the whole ad, and I would highly recommend that you do. It's often called the $2 billion sales letter. It sold over $2 billion worth of subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal from, 1975 up through 2003 or so. And it basically tells a story of one man, these two guys who went to the same high school. They were very similar. And one of them now, today, whatever, 20 years later, 30 years later, is the president, the CEO of a company, and the other one works in that company in some low-level position. What did they do differently? Well, now there's curiosity in the story. People are reading it, go, I want to know. So people would read this ad, and of course the moral of the story was the one guy invested in his financial education with a subscription to something like the Wall Street Journal. The other guy did not, and this sales letter sold over $2 billion worth of subscriptions because of the winners versus losers. This is another example. I don't have time to go through this, but JT told you that I have a photography studio, and I used an ad in my photography studio for brides who were looking to get married. One of the hardest objections, I use stories all the time to overcome objections. In my webinar, I use one. If I have time, I'll tell you about it here in a minute. But like for brides, what do you think the biggest objection to hiring a really good photographer is? Anybody want to guess? Money. It's like $4,000 to hire a really good photographer. Really? I could hire somebody cheap. So if I tried to preach to them about why hiring a cheap photographer is a bad idea, probably not going to get anywhere. So I told two stories of two real girls, one who hired a cheap photographer, her pictures didn't turn out, she was crying, and the other one had a wedding album that she could show to her kids one day, she had a legacy, right? And so all of a sudden they were able to see, maybe I should justify this decision to spend the money on a good photographer instead of going the cheap budget bride route that I've been looking at going. Is it going to convince everybody? No, but it will convince enough of them that I can stay in business, right? The next story I love is the curiosity story. And by the way, the curiosity story could really be combined with any one of these, right? I mean, the winners versus losers, I showed you the Wall Street Journal ad, had a ton of curiosity throughout. But if you just did curiosity, it would be, you could start the story like this: how I got a great result from this strange thing or this counterintuitive thing. So it might be how a strange accident saved me from baldness, ... and then you tell this strange, well, hold on, I got to know what this story is, I'm curious. Or how I started a new life with just $7, right? So if you got started in sand when you didn't have a whole lot of money, something like that could help you to tell a story. The frustration story is another one of my favorites, and it's, again, you can combine this with any of the other 4 stories, but I was so sick of this problem until I tried this solution. Now, if you want to know where do I find stories for my own marketing, well, the first thing I would ask you to do is ask yourself some of these questions. Do I know anybody who's gotten an amazing result with my product, service, or opportunity? Well, of course you do. You've seen people on this stage this weekend. While they're fresh in your mind, write down some of the most compelling stories, and not just the I got more money part of the story, but like what moved you when you heard Kate McShay's story, right? What really moved you? What moved you when you heard, I don't know, Keisha's story, or when you heard Misha's story, or anybody else's story who's been up here? It probably had more to do with not so much the money, but maybe the things they were struggling with, what they were dealing with, and now how those things are gone. Their life is different. What are some horror stories that you maybe know that people could have avoided a terrible situation if they had only known or done this simple thing? A lot of insurance agents can use this. Like I've used this as an example. Like I had an insurance agent who, she knew somebody who didn't buy insurance through her, and a tornado came through town, knocked somebody's house down. This person thought her homeowner's insurance would cover her. She wasn't covered the way she thought she was, and she wasn't fully reimbursed, and like it was a terribly awful story. And if she had only known where to look in her policy to see if she was really covered. Now, is that a story an insurance agent could use to build desire in somebody who didn't even think they wanted insurance to say, God, maybe I better check my policy to see if I'm covered? How hard is that? It's not hard. Anybody could do that, right? What problems and frustrations have people had in the past that they no longer have because of my product, service, or opportunity? What mistakes have people made that resulted in really bad outcomes? Those are all types of questions. I'll go back there real quick. And again, if you didn't get to take a picture of this, you will get all the slides when you go to the link at the bottom of this slide. But all of these are the types of questions that you can ask. Now, when you tell your story, there are certain things in my experience and in my opinion that a really good story should include. So when you're writing a story, there's a few underlying things that you have to make sure exist. You don't necessarily say it out loud all the time when you're telling a story, but there is an underlying promise of a benefit. I know there's something of benefit to me from reading this story, whatever that might be. Like for me, I told the story about how a lead generation company duped me. Well, immediately the underlying idea was, okay, if I read this, I might understand how to not get suckered myself by a lead. There's a benefit there to reading the story. There has to be a driving emotion. Again, people and I don't know how many I've got here, 7, 8 emotions. These are, in my experience, the most powerful reasons why people buy. People do not buy because the comp plan's good or the company's great or it's stable or any of that stuff. People will buy out of fear. They will buy out of anger, out of a situation they're in. They'll buy out of, I want to seek approval. I want to feel pride or accomplishment. I want to get revenge. I want everybody who ever doubted me to see I've made something of myself. Significance, obligation to their family. So whenever I can tie one of those underlying emotions into my story, I know my story is going to perform a heck of a lot better than if I just tell a story for the sake of telling a story.